Atenção para o top de 5 segundos. Milênio. Fundos de investimento Opportunity. Nossa especialidade é administrar recursos.
O que diria o dono de um museu galáctico em futuro muito distante se dedicasse uma parte da exposição aos últimos 1000 anos da nossa história? Quem tenta dar a resposta é o nosso entrevistado, o professor Felipe Armesto. Ele é professor de História em Oxford e autor de um best-seller internacional, A História dos Últimos 1000 Anos. Nesta segunda parte da entrevista, Armesto lida com alguns dos grandes nomes da história. Nomes e contribuições como as de Freud, Marx, Newton, Einstein, eles não ocupariam então um lugar de tamanho destaque, como nós pensamos hoje, em termos de modificação do mundo e de tribuna de honra no Museu Intergaláctico do Futuro?
Well, from the viewpoint of the Galactic Museum keepers, as you know, Zhou Enlai said of the French Revolution, it's too early to say. Newton is dead. I mean, Newton's insights, in the first place, were consistent, really, with traditions of very great antiquity. Newton was really working in a sort of humanistic tradition which owed a great deal to the thought of classical antiquity. And he was part of a long-standing search in the history of science for a systematic vision of the cosmos. We're now pretty sure that that was wrong, and that the cosmos isn't systematic. Rather, it's chaotic and dynamic, and it doesn't have the either the predictability that Newton thought it had, nor does it yield to experiment, you know, in the way that Newton thought it would. We now find that experiment and observation aren't satisfactory and unique ways of finding out about the universe. So I think that the Newtonian model was neither as original as it sometimes appears to be, nor as it had endured very well. It looks as though the same is going to have to be said about Marx, and I say that with great regret because in many ways I'm a tremendous admirer of Marx, and I think people are too dismissive of his contribution to our understanding of history. His main predictions have turned out to be false, and one's got to admit that that is the case. Nevertheless, he did have some important insights about the relationship between material forces, material exigencies, and the way historical relationships change. He was fundamentally right about the dependence of power on wealth. That's one of the reasons why we've seen in recent history, and in a curious way, in one respect, Marx has been vindicated by recent history because we've seen that you can't have regimes which are economically liberal and politically repressive at the same time. But it looks as though we're going to have, in the long run, to say the same about Marx as we've said about Newton. It was a great idea, but unfortunately it was wrong. And you mentioned Freud, and it looks as though Freud is going to go the same way. He's already being classified as someone who was enormously important for one century, but in whose doctrines people have already lost faith. Karl Popper asked a pretty destructive question about the scientific validity of Freudianism. He asked, how do you falsify it? And it looks as though nobody's ever going to come up with a satisfactory answer to that question, and Freud is going to be relegated to the margins of history. And it may be that the same will even be true of Darwin, because although Darwin surely genuinely gave us a new insight into how evolution works, and there are scientists today who have a kind of religious veneration for Darwin, who treat him as a prophet and treat his works as if they were some kind of holy scripture. Nevertheless,
there is a renewal on Darwin in the moment. There is a new interest in Darwin.
Yes, well, I think interest in Darwin has actually never flagged, but what's happening now is that the debate about him is getting more exciting, because the modifications that specialists have brought, in particularly people like Stephen Jay Gould, the theory of punctuated equilibrium, and particularly the impact of chaos theory on what one might, perhaps mischievously call classical Darwinism, have suggested that the Darwinian model of evolution isn't as comprehensive and as reliable as some scientists hoped it would prove to be. So although I expect Darwin always to have a place in the Galactic Museum, it's not going to be perhaps quite such an elevated place as some of those thinkers of the millennium before Christ. And the other character you mentioned was Einstein, and there I think we may be in a different league. Maybe in the Galactic Museum Einstein is going to be up there with characters like Confucius, because I mean, particularly if you see the development of our vision of the cosmos in the 20th century and the new way of looking at the cosmos which quantum mechanics has taught us. If you see that as connected with Einstein rather than as being a reaction against what Einstein said, which is another way of looking at it, then the scientific counter-revolution which Einstein started, the replacement of an ordered model of the cosmos which we inherited from the science of the past, from the scientific revolution, from the Enlightenment of the 18th century, from the systematization of science in the 19th century, the erosion of that model and its substitution by a much more uncertain model in which the cosmos seems much more plastic and much more uncontainable than it ever seemed before, and in which the range of what is observable between the infinitesimal particles of quantum mechanics and the vastness of the infinite, our awareness of the range of what we can observe is so small, I think does represent a huge paradigm shift. And if it's right to ascribe that to Einstein, at least to choose Einstein as a representative figure in launching that transformation of our view of the world, then Einstein may be the only character of the recent past to achieve a place in the Galactic Museum comparable with that of the sages of the millennium before Christ.
Como o senhor se situa nessa discussão tão antiga a respeito do papel da personalidade na história? Indivíduos mudam a história?
I'm sometimes criticized for being a bit of a materialist in my writings about history, because I'm interested in the material remains of the past, and I treat matter as evidence, and in my work I try to transcend the notion that history has to be extrapolated only from documents and from writings and from text. And therefore I treat it as if it were more than just a sort of humane discipline. And I also try to see it as more than a subject which is just about one species. History traditionally has been thought to be a study of man, but I don't think you can understand man except in the environment in which he belongs, in the ecosystem into which he's meshed. And therefore I try to encompass the whole of nature in my study of history, and see it as a relationship between man and the rest of nature. Nevertheless, although I'm sometimes mistaken for a materialist for those reasons, I am not a materialist. I think that everything starts with thought, and that everything that happens is an idea before it becomes a material reality. And therefore, I think that human individuals can change the way the world works by thinking up new ideas which are going to subsequently become embodied in people's material lives. I don't think that the individuals who've changed history have been, the great generals and conquerors and and kind of rich entrepreneurs and people like that. But I do think that thinkers have the power to change the lives of the rest of us.
Nesses 1000 anos de história que o senhor tratou no seu livro, o Brasil entra só no segundo tempo, a partir dos 500 anos. E se o senhor coloca o Brasil na perspectiva dos donos do Museu Intergaláctico, qual é o lugar que países como o Brasil, que a América Latina tem na história mundial? É apenas a margem?
No, not at all on the margins. Brazil occupies a central representative place in my vision of the Galactic Museum of the Future. We don't know enough about what happened in what is now Brazil in the first half of the millennium to say very much about it with any confidence. But I mean, if you think, as I do, that world history is about cultural transmission, about the way some cultures influence others, and about what I call the shifts of initiative, by which I mean the power of some human groups to influence the way other human groups think and behave and live, then I think that, that Latin America, and indeed Brazil in particular, are an arena of enormous importance in the history of this millennium. Because one of the themes that the Galactic Museum keepers are going to draw attention to is the way, in the course of this millennium, formerly sundered cultures reach out to one another, come together in contact, in contagion, in conflict and commerce, and transform one another. And what better paradigm would you have for that than Brazil, which is arguably the most multicultural country in the world today. I mean, it's almost, a sort of exemplary case of what has happened to the world in this millennium. And it's also been the place, from which so many products and influences have radiated to other parts of the world, like can you imagine what today's world would be like if maize and chilies and peanuts and tomatoes hadn't radiated from Latin America and transformed the food of other parts of the world? Or rubber is one of those great products, and quinine is another product which probably came originally from Peru, like the potato. But of course, Portuguese long-range navigations, which touched on Brazil and then took these products elsewhere around the world, were very important vectors of transmission. And it's also been an arena where influences from everywhere else have been received. I mean, above all, the human vectors of change. And Brazil is a sort of museum of humanity with, and the really big transformations of the latter part of this millennium, the spread of European migrants around the world, and particularly across the Atlantic, the enormous demographic input from Africa into the Americas. These are brilliantly exemplified in Brazilian society. You can still see the effects of that there today. So Brazil is, a kind of exemplary case of one of the most conspicuous kinds of change which have transformed the world in this millennium. And I guess the Galactic Museum keepers will find some small space in the little vitrine which they devote to our planet for Brazil.
Tem trecho muito bonito no seu livro a respeito da festa de Iemanjá, quando as pessoas colocam barcos na água para que eles voltem à Mãe África. Olhando o Brasil com a perspectiva que o senhor tem, a qual âmbito cultural o senhor diria que o Brasil pertence?
Well, I'm a partisan of the notion of Atlantic civilization. And it seems to me that in the early modern period, in the 17th and 18th centuries particularly, this Atlantic civilization was genuinely Atlantic, by which I mean that it was as much African as European in terms of demographic input. Because the Brazilian economy of those centuries depended so much on African labor sources. Brazil's retained this character to a greater extent than most other Atlantic side communities. So I see Brazil as exemplifying. That's why Brazil is chosen in the television programs based on Millennium as the mise en scène for demonstrating what Atlantic society of the early modern period was like, because it's there that this character is perhaps best conserved. One of the really, I think, moments in the television series which I'm particularly pleased with and proud of, if I can say that, is the passage in which we visit Palmares and see the theatre of power of King Zumbi, because Palmares was an African state on the other side of the Atlantic for practically the whole of the 17th century. So I mean, I think Brazil should be appreciated for its own sake, because it's a unique country, and by assimilating it to a broader category, I don't want to give the impression that I don't think Brazil is interesting as Brazil, but the category, in my categorization of world history to which it belongs, is that of Atlantic civilization in the true sense, which is black as well as white, African as well as European. Perhaps the element, which has played a surprisingly small part in the history of Brazil is the Native American element, because that has been marginalized in Brazilian history, and maybe that's the price that Brazil has paid for becoming an exemplary multicultural state. I mean, one of the tragedies, of all modern experiments in multiculturalism is that there always seems to be somebody who gets left out. Another great example is Australia. The Australians have created really very recently, in the last 30 years, a genuine multicultural state in many ways quite similar to Brazil. You can always say that Brazil's been the model for a small-scale experiment of the same kind in Australia, where they now have radio broadcasts in 78 languages. That's just a measure of the vibrancy of Australian society. But the Aboriginals have got left out of that, rather in the same way as the Native Americans have got left out of the making of Brazil.
Nós temos a tendência, chegando ao final de um século, de considerar que isto é uma divisão na história. Lendo o seu livro, percebemos que, por exemplo, uma divisão histórica importante foi a peste negra no século XIV. O senhor acha que nós estamos vivendo um momento de divisão, que estamos começando uma nova era, ou somos apenas prisioneiros do próprio espírito de todo mundo que chega ao final de um século?
Most people, in most periods of history, have thought that they lived in times of cosmic, cataclysmic change. And they usually thought that it was change for the worse. They were usually very pessimistic about it, and thought that the end of civilization as we know it was imminent. And there are a lot of people around today who think that about our own times. In evaluating their assessment, one's got to remember that it's par for the course. It's what people always think about their own world. But nevertheless, there are some persuasive candidates around today for being the sources of vast transformations of the world of the future. First of all, there's the kind of postmodern reading of our times, which says that one period has come to an end. You mentioned Marx earlier in our conversation, and in Marxist terms, one phase of world history came to an end when industrialization was transformed into a kind of post-industrial situation. We've now got a different means of production governing the way we generate wealth around the world. And you could say that the global communications revolution is the most striking feature of this post-industrial economic framework of life. Then there's also the transformations which are promised or threatened by science. I don't personally think that information technology has the power to change the world. It seems to me that information technology just gives us more of what we've already had. It doesn't give us anything radically different. I mean, it maybe gives us rather more information, rather less wisdom and knowledge and learning. But I think on the whole it's a matter of degree rather than kind. But the revolution of genetic science really does open up the prospect of a radically different world. Previously in this millennium, human beings have only made one really major intervention in evolution, and that's been the replacement of a divergent model of evolution in which, you know, every continent was developing its own biota, its own species, its own look. That divergent model, which had been around really as far as we know from the beginning of life on Earth, certainly from the, you know, the time when the continents began to drift apart from one another. So it's this very long-standing pattern of evolution. That changed as a result of human intervention in the course of the last millennium as a result of long-range communications which transferred biota from one continent to another. And we've now got a world of convergent evolution where all over the world you get the same sort of products, the same kind of life forms, and indeed, you know, sort of same mélange of people, because people now, you know, got this kind of transfer of ethnic groups and races worldwide. So that was the first big intervention in evolution. It could be that genetic engineering is going to be our second big intervention in evolution, because it may empower us to bring natural selection to an end in the case of certain species, including our own, and substitute for natural selection a different method of changing the way the species evolves. So that could be, I mean, if that does happen, that could be a radical new departure, which enables us to say one period has come to an end and another has begun. But when you ask me about divisions in the world, I immediately think of a different category altogether. I think of the processes which are going to arrest globalization and return us to a world of conflict and division where we all sense that we have different conflicting identities. And I'm worried that that's going to happen. I think people tend to be rather complacent nowadays about globalization and modernization around the world and think that we're all going to share the same values in the future. One should never be complacent about anything in history, because complacency almost always precedes disaster. And there are at least two processes which are going to threaten this globalized paradise. One is, you know, the atomization of society. Because I think of individualism as a great thing, but it can go too far. And we could face a highly atomized world in which individuals withdraw into themselves or into ghettos of the like-minded, and social bonds of a traditional kind vanish entirely. And the second big danger is that the old differences of values which divided us, the clash of ideologies, the division of the world into communist and capitalist camps, the old wars of religion, those differences of value are going to be replaced by new ones which are going to create even more hostile chasms in the world, either, you know, reversion to new forms of totalitarianism, or one thing which could fill the ideology vacuum that we've got at the moment today is religious fundamentalism. And if that happens, then, you know, it's going to be extremely uncomfortable world for the rest of us, because whenever religious fundamentalists have taken power in the past, they've used it to persecute everybody else and to fight each other. So those are the divisions which I see opening up in the world of today, which really worry me.
Nós corremos o perigo, então, de no futuro vivermos numa sociedade totalitária, do ponto de vista religioso fundamentalista e povoada por indivíduos geneticamente programados?
It's always a good idea to postulate the worst case scenario. I'm, you know, sort of pessimist by temperament, and I would recommend pessimism to everybody, because it's really the only way we've got of indemnifying ourselves against disappointment. And the function of a prophet isn't to be right. And when I forecast this terrifying future, I don't do so in order to be right. I do so in the active hope that I shall be wrong. Because the worst thing for a prophet is to be proved right. You know, Cassandra was only right about the fall of Troy because no one took any notice of her. And the function of prophecy isn't to be right. It's to arm ourselves against disaster.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me.
Um estilista autodidata que começou a carreira costurando suas próprias criações. Qualidade, distribuição, venda, o corpo e a moda. O pensamento de Tufi Dueck, um criador que se inspira no Brasil.
No fundo, você está transmitindo de alguma maneira, e aí eu vejo muito desse jeito, que a roupa tem alma.
Estilo em Almanac, com Regina Martelli. Nesta segunda, 00:30.
Best of, os maiores sucessos de sua carreira pela primeira vez em um único CD. Já à venda, Globo ou Warner.
Sabe aqueles dias que você acorda nota 4? Não adianta, por mais que você tente, se esforce, dá tudo errado. O máximo que você consegue é chegar no final do dia, nota 8. Por outro lado, quando você entra no bar, o dia pode virar nota 10. Cerveja, nota 10, bota gás nessa. Pois é, tudo na vida tem dois lados.
Amor, assinei a NET. Olha, eles instalam em até 72 horas. Caso contrário, o primeiro mês é grátis. Olha aí, ó. É a NET no ar.
Instalação em 72 horas, onde já se viu. Na NET você vê.
Ano novo mesmo, tem quem fizer um plano da Bradesco Previdência antes do dia 31. Tem ano novo, futuro novo e dedução no imposto de renda.
Essa virada é por minha conta.
Bradesco Previdência. Seu futuro do tamanho do Bradesco.
Participe da promoção Assinatura Premiada do Estadão. Assine muito mais jornal com muito mais vantagens. Pague menos a cada mês e concorra a 15 Renault Scenic, 1 por semana e a um apartamento no final. Só o Estadão para fazer uma promoção assim.
Pai.
Oi, filha.
Eu comprei uma calça jeans.
Tá bom, deixa aqui.
De grife, foi caro.
Tá bom.
Peraí, você não vai bufar?
Não.
Vai falar um palavrãozinho? Nenhumzinho?
Não.
Ué, ele é outro depois que abrir uma conta no Sudameris.
Cheque 10+1 Sudameris. 11 dias sem juros e sem estresse. Sudameris. Você de bem com seu banco.
Durante séculos, grandes gênios desenvolveram teorias para a evolução da humanidade. A LG apenas utilizou essas teorias para levar você à era digital. A tecnologia Flatron. Monitores e TVs LG Flatron. Tela 100% plana. Imagem 100% perfeita. O novo jeito de ver o milênio. LG Flatron.
Atenção para o top de 5 segundos. Conta corrente. Fundos de Investimento Opportunity. Nossa especialidade é administrar recursos. Conta corrente. Apoio Global Star. O telefone para você falar fora da área de cobertura.
Eu sou Tamara Lesta e você vai ver nessa edição do Conta Corrente. O Tesouro Nacional prevê um superávit acima da meta fixada com o FMI e, por conta, aumenta o orçamento para os ministérios. Mais um índice aponta para a desaceleração do ritmo de crescimento da inflação. A Bolsa de Valores de São Paulo movimenta hoje quase 3 bilhões e meio de reais. O conselheiro da Bolsa e diretor da corretora Censo, Álvaro Bandeira, analisa os bons ventos que sopram no mercado de ações. Ele é nosso entrevistado. O Conta Corrente está começando agora. O Tesouro Nacional adiantou hoje que o governo federal deve fechar novembro com um superávit primário bem próximo de 1 bilhão e 200 milhões de reais. O superávit primário não contabiliza os gastos com juros. Esse valor dá uma folga de 3 bilhões de reais em relação à meta fixada com o FMI. Agora é bom destacar, esse resultado só vai ser alcançado se estados e municípios mantiverem os gastos sob controle. Bem, por conta desse superávit, o governo já anunciou que vai aumentar em 1 bilhão e meio de reais os gastos com investimentos. O dinheiro extra vai para a área social. As contas públicas. Em outubro, o governo registrou um superávit primário, como eu disse, aquele que não considera as despesas com juros, inferior ao de setembro. Mesmo assim, esse resultado é o melhor já alcançado em um mês de outubro nos últimos 5 anos. E não comprometeu a meta acertada com o FMI. Vejam os números divulgados hoje pelo Banco Central. As contas públicas fecharam outubro da seguinte forma. O governo federal entrou com a maior parte, um superávit de 979 milhões de reais. Os estados e municípios também fecharam o mês com saldo positivo de 476 milhões de reais. Resultado, um superávit primário de 1 bilhão 455 milhões de reais. No acumulado do ano de janeiro a outubro, o superávit chega a 32 bilhões de reais, quase 2 bilhões de reais acima da meta acertada com o FMI para todo o ano de 99. O déficit nominal, que inclui o pagamento de juros, fechou outubro em quase 8 bilhões de reais. A dívida líquida do setor público vem caindo mês a mês. Em outubro ficou em 519 bilhões de reais. O Banco Central prevê que a relação dívida pública-PIB, Produto Interno Bruto, deve cair dos 48,8% registrados em novembro para 46,5% até o ano 2001. E mais um índice confirma a desaceleração da inflação. Na semana passada, nós vimos que o GPM, o Índice Geral de Preços do Mercado, calculado pela Fundação Getúlio Vargas, recuou. Agora foi a vez do IPC, o Índice de Preço ao Consumidor da região metropolitana de São Paulo. Veja os números da segunda prévia de dezembro, que é calculado pela FIP, a Fundação Instituto de Pesquisas Econômicas da USP. Na segunda prévia de dezembro, o IPC ficou em 1,01%. Na prévia anterior, a taxa foi de 1,34%. As maiores altas foram registradas nos setores de transportes e de alimentação. E as maiores baixas aconteceram no setor de vestuário e na área de saúde. Os técnicos da FIP projetam para dezembro um IPC de 0,5% e para o ano todo de 99, uma inflação de 8,7%, contra a deflação de 1,79% registrada no ano passado. E a Bolsa de Valores de São Paulo viveu hoje um dia de euforia, como há muito tempo não se via, até rimou. Veja os detalhes com Mônica Tiarelli.
A Bolsa de Valores de São Paulo foi palco hoje do mais movimentado exercício de opções desde abril de 1998. Foram exercidas todas as séries de opções do recibo Telebrás até R$ 200. Quem esperava o enfraquecimento após a briga entre comprados e vendidos se surpreendeu com o volume de negócios. A Bovespa movimentou 3 bilhões 478 milhões de reais, com os exercícios de opção respondendo por 1 bilhão 920 milhões de reais. O clima de otimismo fez a Bolsa Paulista subir 2,17% e atingir 15.110 pontos, um novo recorde. O dólar chegou a despencar pela manhã, mas acabou encerrando o dia em alta de 0,22%, cotada a R$ 1,812 para a venda. Especialistas lembram que a falta de liquidez está provocando uma maior volatilidade no mercado, que tende a ficar